Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to another edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg, who, I read this week, and I want to say it came as a complete surprise to me, is going to be the subject of a biography by Conservative Home's proprietor, Lord Ashcroft.
Indeed, Lord Ashcroft very courteously called on me to say that this is what he was going to do and that I couldn't discourage him because he'd made up his mind. And it's very flattering, but very surprising. I think biographies are usually best written of people who are dead, and I have no intention of being in that state for a year or two.
Did you say why he wanted to write it?
He gave an indication of why he wanted to do it, but you know, Lord Ashcroft is generally interested in politics. But nonetheless, I'm a backbench MP, and I don't think that I am of the right stature to have a biography written about me.
I don't know about that. My only thought about it to date was that very often with a biography you want to find someone who's a bit of a closed book and about whom one can reveal something surprising. We all remember what that was or was alleged to have been in the case of David Cameron, but you strike me very much as an open book.
I've led a pretty open life. I don't think there's anything very exciting that I do. I lead quite a quiet life in many ways. Well,
we'll see. I mustn't put people off this exciting new venture by Con Home's proprietor. So, on a completely different note, turning from someone you've obviously had a very amenable conversation with to someone you are on apparently rather difficult terms with, Jacob, you're one of the politest of people, but Mark Carney really seems to bring out a vituperative side of you that some of our listeners might not have thought was there. Is that fair?
Yes, I think it is. I think that Mark Carney has debauched the Bank of England in a political campaign where he should have remained independent. The Governor of the Bank of England has never been able to answer one very simple question on the political forecasts that the bank has given on Brexit. And that is, why does the bank not make any forecasts in a general election about the opposition's economic policy? The election in 2017, there was not a word from the bank about the economic effects of Jeremy Corbyn's policies. They kept quiet because it was a political matter and the bank has to maintain political neutrality. And this is important because all forecasts are speculative. Forecasts are very rarely right when you look back at them, and they tend to follow what people expect, not just because of economics, but also because of their overall view of the world. And the bank has therefore been very, very cautious to keep clear of politics until Mr. Carney's period of office, and I think that's been damaging to the reputation of the bank, and I think it's been quite improper.
Wouldn't he say he's not doing forecasts? He's conducting stress tests.
I think that's specious, and bear in mind, before the referendum, he said that there would be a technical recession. That was quite clearly a forecast. He also said it was likely interest rates would go up, and he then cut them immediately after the referendum result. He does make forecasts and saying that they are simply stress tests, but that the stress tests are absolutely at their worst if we leave the European Union, I think is bogus. And I'm not alone in this. Very interesting. Andrew Sentence has been critical, former member of the Monetary Policy Committee, and it was reported in the papers that the Monetary Policy Committee itself was cautious about these tests being released. And the other thing is that the tests were released to fit in with the government's media management plan. They don't have a leg to stand on in terms of independence. It's clearly politically motivated and not what the Bank of England is there to do.
Let's turn to the government's plans as we head towards the meaningful vote. A week today, as the readers listen, namely Tuesday, we're recording this conversation the day before on the Monday. Is it appropriate for the government to be spending taxpayers' money promoting a deal that Parliament's not yet endorsed if it does?
I think it's perfectly legitimate to spend Conservative Party money. I don't agree with the decision, but the Prime Minister is leader of the Conservative Party, and for the Conservative Party to produce leaflets that nobody will deliver is a matter for them to argue with the Treasurer's Department. But in terms of government funding, no, of course it's not right. Though I have a feeling it's in the treaty that the government has agreed to promote its proposals. I heard somebody say that. I haven't noticed that particular part of the text.
The treaty's not been ratified?
No, but it's been agreed to by a head of government.
Would that legitimise the spending of the money, in your view?
Well, not politically, no. Whether it does so legally is another question. I think it's quite improper for the government to spend money promoting its party political agenda.
Are you, or is anyone you know of, pursuing the matter of how much is being spent?
I think a number of people are pursuing the matter and trying to find out, and I'm sure it is a matter that will come into the public domain.
On that point about the Conservative Party, during the referendum, the party was neutral. It realised that the question divided the Conservative Party, and there was agreement at the top. The party itself would not get involved one way or the other, but it has taken a different decision this time, evidently. Do you think that's right?
Well, I think David Cameron showed his wisdom in doing that, actually, that it was so divisive and remains divisive that therefore the party stood above it and that people campaigned as individuals. And that meant that association offices couldn't be used for one side of the campaign or the other. And you could easily have found, if David Cameron hadn't made that decision, that association offices were being used for different sides of the campaign. So I think it was a good way of binding the party together. I think it is unwise but not illegitimate of the leader of the party to get money spent in this way. Why is it unwise? Because it's divisive. In the response from association members is that this is absurd and they don't want to see the money they're giving to the party spent in this way. And from associations that I've addressed recently, the deal is extremely unpopular. It at least matches your survey results.
Have you any idea how much is being spent of party money on this?
Again, I don't know, but they've produced a glossy leaflet. Glossy leaflets aren't that expensive. But it's bad tonally. As I say, it's unwise, but it's not illegitimate.
The leaflets are intended, as I understand it, to stir up people to lobby their MPs. So the very peculiar position of the Conservative Party spending money to lobby Conservative MPs. Are these cards, as you understand it, going out to voters who will send them in to their MPs saying, "Dear Mr. Rees Mogg, please vote for this deal"? Or are they going to association offices for members to sign?
I don't know what they're planning to do. I think it's a pretty silly approach because most members and most Conservatives oppose the deal, as all the polling shows. So who are these mystery people who are going to fill out these cards and lobby their members of Parliament?
But you have heard of the cards going to association offices, have you?
I think I've seen that reported, but I don't want to hold myself up as an expert on this. We know money's being spent, we know these things are being produced. What the purpose of them is debatable.
And let's look forward to the vote. In particular now to the aftermath. First of all, on the vote itself, I think some of the estimates in the press suggesting rather airily that 100 Conservative MPs are opposed are a bit weightless. We had a proper Conhome look at it and came up at a number that was more like 65. Even that 65, often people will use the formula that I think you have, which is I cannot support this deal. Now in your case, that will be a vote against. In some cases, that might be an abstention, might it not?
I think that's right. I think the numbers have got ridiculously elevated. I think whatever happens, it will be a close result, and I would not rule out the possibility of the government winning. I think in the end it will depend whether there are more Labour supporters of the government than there are Conservative opponents of the government. The government, of course, was very unwise to lose the support of the Democratic Unionists because that makes its job much harder to start with. And We'll have to see if the government pulls any rabbits out of the hat between now and next Tuesday. But, plus or minus 5, I think, is where it's likely to end up, not minus 100 or any of these silly numbers.
Do you have a sense of whether there's a substantial body of Labour MPs prepared to vote against this deal? Because whether it's 100 or whether it's 25, there's clearly a substantial number of Conservative MPs prepared to vote against it.
There are some, aren't there? There's Caroline Flint, who seems to be willing to support the deal and represents a serious strand of thought within the Labour Party. And it will be interesting to see what conclusion they come to at the end. Bear in mind, a lot of Labour MPs want to remain in the customs union, which is what this deal does. So it's not all done and dusted. And that's why the Prime Minister is campaigning so hard for it. She must think she's still in with a chance.
Very interested to hear you say you think the government could win. I think that's the first time I've heard what I call leading Brexiteers say that. But I want now to think ahead on the assumption that...
Well, can I, before we go on, just clarify why I say that? It is very rare and very hard for governments to lose votes. It does happen occasionally, but it is highly, highly unusual because of party loyalty, party discipline, patronage, the general power of the state. And so if it is lost, even by one vote, that is a very, very dramatic result.
You are, of course, thereby suggesting that even some of the people on our lower list of 65 who've said they're going to oppose the deal in the lobbies don't.
I'm sure that some people will change sides in all directions. Who would have thought Sam Gyimah was going to resign? That wasn't at the forefront of our mind when we had a discussion a fortnight ago. So there will be lots of movement.
But I want to look forward for a moment, because so many other people are doing so, and it's important to do so, to what happens if the government loses. And first of all, there's dramatic talk about a general election, a second referendum, the Prime Minister resigning, or a leadership challenge. Actually, isn't the most likely course to be that she goes back to Brussels, where she's due to go, I think, in the next few days after the vote anyway, to try to wring some sort of concession, real or imagined, out of the EU?
Well, other things will happen. The Labour Party is saying it wants to put down a vote of confidence. In my view, the government is at more risk from a vote of confidence if the meaningful vote goes through, because then it loses the support of the DUP. If the meaningful vote is blocked, then the DUP have no reason to vote against the government in a vote of confidence under the terms of the Fixed Term Parliament Act. So the Labour Party may ask for one, it may be the logical next step for them, but if the meaningful vote is lost, I would expect the Prime Minister to win that. But yes, you're absolutely right. Of course the Prime Minister would go off to Brussels, and what are we likely to get? I think it's perfectly possible to get a date for the removal of the backstop. But that doesn't really help, because you'll have the same argument then as you've got now. You'll say, well, we'd be leaving without a deal, and wouldn't that be frightening? So it's not, the backstop is in itself bad. It's not just whether or not it's got a date. And it's fascinating that Ollie Robbins has now been revealed to have told the Prime Minister this was a bad deal. Even her closest advisors saying it was a duff deal, and that's very important, because this is now a deal that's very closely associated with the Prime Minister.
If we were able to depart the backstop unilaterally, then we'd be able to depart from the customs union, we'd be able to strike our own trade deals. It has been argued, and I think with some fairness, that the Prime Minister's prized apart the four freedoms a bit by at least on paper, being able to control our migration. We wouldn't be paying any more money. The way would be open under the terms of the political declaration for something that's more like a Canada deal.
Well,
surely, if
are you sure we won't be paying any more money? If we're in the customs union, will the customs revenues be viewed as own resources?
This was after departure from the customs union, following departure from the backstop, under the assumption we were unilaterally able to leave it.
But the issue then is that we face exactly the same problem as leaving on the 29th of March. Why aren't we just leaving on the 29th of March? Because everyone's saying, oh, this is very frightening. And if you were leaving in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time and you hadn't got a deal, then aren't people saying exactly the same thing? So the whole pressure is to remain within the backstop until you've got a deal, which the EU won't give you because the backstop suits the EU extremely well.
I think this is a very interesting side conversation. I suppose the question would be whether, if the government, led by the Conservative Party, had the ability to leave, whether that ought to be enough for Brexiteers on the ground that, well, if we've got the freedom to leave, then we will be able to leave. But that can be debated back and forth. That can be debated
if it comes forward.
Because this is a conversation based on something we haven't got. Which is the unilateral right.
That's right, but you're right to be thinking about what is the next step. And I think one of the next steps is to go back to Europe and say, look, can we make this or that change? The other is to go for what has been called managed no deal, and that is to make a payment for a standstill, during which time a free trade deal could be negotiated or preparations for world trade terms could be put in place. And I think those will be the two most likely outcomes. The argument that there is no alternative deal is, as I think Barry Gardner rightly said, she would say that, wouldn't she, category. It's obviously true that nobody wants to admit there's an alternative deal until they've had their first deal rejected.
Of course. But let's talk about what happens if either the Prime Minister tries to gloss or change the present deal and fails, or doesn't try at all. Because I'm very curious about what the government's stance now is. Now, the position used to be no deal was better than a bad deal. And the Prime Minister obviously now believes this deal is better than no deal. But she was asked by Esther McVey on the 21st of November in the Commons whether she'd give a categorical assurance that we will leave the EU on the 29th of March. And she said, I can give the Honourable Lady Esther McVey that assurance. But Michael Gove said yesterday, we've got to recognise if we don't vote for the Prime Minister's deal, the alternatives are no deal or no Brexit. These two statements can't both be true, can they?
Well, it's better or worse than that, depending on which way you want to put it. When the Prime Minister gave the answer to Esther McVey, about 20 minutes before, in answer to another question, she had said, it's either going to be no Brexit or no deal. So the Prime Minister contradicted herself within 20 minutes. She didn't need to be contradicted by Michael Gove 10 days later. And this is an obvious confusion in government policy. And it's part of the reason the deal is in such difficulty is because the government is so unclear about what it's trying to do and has said one thing and done another. And that's very damaging to trust in politics.
Didn't Yvette Cooper have a point when she said to the Prime Minister at the Liaison Committee last week, in effect this, I've known you for 20 years, and these are now my words, Jacob, and I'm glossing, but she said in effect, look, you may once have believed no deal is better than a bad deal, but you plainly now believe no deal is the worst outcome of all. So in the event of your deal going down, aren't you preparing to yield to demands to put the Brexit date off and have a second referendum?
Well, I mean, I think the government would be in terrible trouble if it tried that. I think that would lead to further resignations, and that the denial of democracy of the second referendum without having a general election first would, I think, do such deep damage to our democracy, our trust in democracy, and the bitterness surrounding the first vote would be as nothing to the bitterness around a second vote. People were told, this is your choice, you decide, it will happen. If they're then told, well, you made a mistake, so we're not listening, that's disastrous for democracy. There's no point in voting under those circumstances.
I'm struggling to see where the government policy is going, because first, it is the case that the Prime Minister has given previous assurances that have turned out not to hold. For example, on migration control during transition and so on. We'll take that as a
and
given.
fish and so on. I don't think anyone is holding too tightly to previous assurances of any kind.
Precisely, and that's why I want to keep probing away at this question about a general election or a second referendum, because if you'd have asked me 4 months ago, I'd have said, no, I don't think the Prime Minister will yield on a second referendum. I'm not so sure now. Let me read you an extract from what Liam Fox said in a speech over the weekend about all this, that I think sums up a certain feeling about the way things are going. And he said this: "The truth is," he said, "that Parliament is sovereign and Parliament will decide the way forward. When I look across the House, I see John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn mobilising for a second referendum, and I see the SNP whose sole aim is to break apart our country. MPs can ask the Speaker for emergency debates to have their say. The House of Lords will have the chance to amend the trade, fisheries and immigration bills. We need to leave. There are laws we need to pass for any sort of ordered Brexit. These would be at risk of amendment by the opponents of Brexit, either to require the government to seek an extension of Article 50 or to deliver the most chaotic possible exit in an attempt to force a change of course." He concluded, "Wherever you look, their direction of travel is clear and not in our favour." Now, this seemed to suggest to me that leading members of the government, leading Brexiteers within the government, are already looking ahead to losing the vote and believe that it's possible that a delay to Brexit or a second referendum or both will be forced on the government.
Well, nothing can be forced on the government if the government holds its nerve. That the government controls the legislative timetable. The bills that are being talked about are important pieces of legislation, all of which can be brought forward after we've left on the 29th of March. They can complete their passage after that. There's no need to bring them forward before. It might be more convenient to do so, but the government has singularly failed because it can't agree to bring forward its immigration bill, which is an important part of this process. So if the government holds its nerve, because it controls the parliamentary timetable, there is no means of legislating to insist that we remain in the European Union. There are means of passing motions, there are means of summoning ministers to the dispatch box, but there's nothing that can change the law, and crucially the Withdrawal Act comes into force on the 29th of March 2019, assuming no other law is passed to supersede it. And therefore it's a question of, can the government cope with the political pressure of losing votes in the House of Commons, and that's a matter of backbone.
So when Liam says the Lords will have the chance to amend the trade, fisheries and immigration bills, you're saying you don't have to have these bills in place as acts before the 29th of March?
That's right. It would be more convenient to, but if they're not in place before the 29th of March, you pass them after the 29th of March, but by then we've left and the whole political argument becomes very different, because then we would have to rejoin as a new joiner on a completely different set of terms, including with the euro and with Schengen.
Clearly, in your view, the government could, in effect, from whatever date we begin with, I mean, let us say, you know, as early as before Christmas, from that period until March the 29th, really not bring forward any legislation that might be amended in the ways that Fox suggests, and just withstand the pressure of votes in the Commons.
It could bring through important domestic legislation on, say, housing, and deal with all the many other problems that the country faces, and leave the European bills until after we've left. Admittedly, on the 29th of March at 11 o'clock in the evening, we would not have a very satisfactory immigration policy for EU nationals. They'd still be able to come in, but you deal with that afterwards.
Right, when, in your view, the political pressure to amend those bills will have gone?
Will have gone because we'll have left.
Yes. So therefore, it's really boiling down to this, to whether or not the government's got the political will to resist.
Two things. That is obviously one of them. The other is the government wants to get its meaningful vote through. And that's why Theresa May and Liam Fox, to some extent, are trying to ride, and Michael Gove, two horses. One horse is to scare people like me and say, if you don't do as you're told, if you're not a good boy, you'll get no Brexit. And the other is to say, to people on the other side of the argument that if you're not a helpful Member of Parliament, we'll have leave without a deal. And these are things that are designed to scare either side of the argument to get them to agree to the government's rotten deal. But I don't think we're that stupid, and we've noticed the discontinuity between their two statements.
One element of the picture going forward we haven't discussed is whether or not at some point during the next few weeks there'll be a leadership challenge. And I raise this late because looking at our leadership survey results for this month, which I expect to publish tomorrow, Tuesday morning, my reading of them is that the members have stopped thinking there will be a challenge because one has been mooted so many times and hasn't happened. Where do you think we are on that?
Well, I don't know, and I haven't seen your results, so I don't know what they've come up with. Time will tell. I don't think I'm in a great position to make a forecast as to when it will happen, but leadership contests always happen eventually.
Well, I thought you wouldn't want to be drawn on this because, I mean, obviously you put in your own letter, but as far as we know, and it'll be Tuesday tomorrow, so anything will have happened, could have happened, the 48 have not arrived. I'm just mentioning it because I think there's a tendency now to think that because it hasn't happened, it won't happen. And I don't suppose one can be sure of that, given the tumultuous events that lie ahead of us over the next week.
You're no doubt right, but I'm probably not the person to make forecasts on it.
Are you aware, at the moment, does it really sort of come within your view, of how the whips are handling this vote?
I think the whips are doing what the whips normally do. They're trying to persuade people, they're trying to encourage members to support. I think the whole panoply of whips' power is being used. Courtesy, encouragement, patronage, chatting. There's stories going around that the PPSs have been told to go to the tea rooms and sing the virtues of the deal, all of that. And that's quite right and proper. It's what the whips are there for.
But you're not aware of that so far making an impact on the 65 or so people who are on our Con Home list as being opposed?
This is perhaps the most important issue people will ever vote on in their parliamentary lives. It was very interesting talking to Shailesh Vara, who obviously resigned as Northern Ireland Minister. And he said, and I hope you won't think I'm being indiscreet in repeating it, but I was so impressed by it because I think it's so important and should guide us all in politics. He said, most time, you can go along with what government policy is, even if you think it could be done a little bit better, because it can be changed and it's not the be-all and the end-all. But that actually, if at the end of your career you look back and you say, I did something I didn't believe in on the most important vote in my parliamentary career, you have to ask yourself, what is your point of being in Parliament?
And on that note, Jacob, we will end this week's Mogcast. By the time we next meet, Christmas preparations will be in full flow and we will have had the meaningful vote and goodness knows where we'll all be. I look forward to it very much. Thank you again.
As always, great pleasure. Thank you.
The Mogcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day.